Hello and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. And happy Diwali to everybody. My name is Adhvaryu. I'm the Tata Endowed Professor of Economics and the Director of the 21st Century India Center at UC San Diego's School of Global Policy and Strategy. The India Center's purpose is to foster a greater understanding of India and U.S.-India relations, India's economy, its people, through academic research, educational initiatives, and policy engagement and impact. Which brings us to today's exciting event. We are so pleased to be co-hosting this panel discussion with our colleagues at the 21st Century China Center. Uh, Global dynamics are rapidly evolving, and the complex relationships between the United States, India, and China, three of the major countries in the world, are being reshaped in significant ways. So today we're bringing together an amazing panel of experts to examine the current trilateral and bilateral dynamics and explore, how these shifting alliances and trade policies and investment flows are redefining opportunities and challenges for all of these countries. It's my pleasure to co-moderate today's conversation with my colleague Victor Shih, who's the director of the 21st Century China Center and a professor of political science here at UC San Diego. And right now, I'll just invite Victor to say a word or two about the China Center before we proceed.
Thank you, Arch. I'm Victor Sheen, the director of the 21st Century China Center. We're a center dedicated to collecting large data sets and using cutting-edge social science research tools to study contemporary China and then bringing those results to the policy discussion on US and China. Like the India Center, we also, of course, try to build bridges with our counterparts in the research community within China. So I'm very excited also to join this first event, a joint event between the China and India Center at UCSD, as we collectively at the School of Global Policy and Strategy navigate a conversation about the future of Asia and the Asia Pacific region.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Victor. We're going to take turns asking questions, and in the interest of, cross-regional exchange and collaboration, I'm going to ask, questions mostly on to the China experts on our panel, and Victor's going to direct his questions to the India experts. So I'm hoping that kind of cross-examination is going to help us all kind of learn something new today and liven up the atmosphere a bit as well. So before we start the questions, I'm just going to take a moment to introduce our distinguished panelists. So I'm going to start with Dhruva Jayashankar. Dhruva is the executive director of the Observer Research Foundation America, a public policy think tank in Washington, D.C., which he helped to establish in 2020. He also serves as the vice president of the Americas at the parent organization, the Observer Research Foundation in India. He's the author of Vishwa Shastra, the India in the World, a foundational textbook on on India's international relations. And he writes regularly for popular media and journalist outlets, and his commentary has appeared in numerous Indian and international publications. Welcome, Dhruva. Thanks for being here. Um,
Yeah, we're also happy to welcome Tanvi Madan from Brookings Institution. She's a senior fellow in the Center of Asia Policy Studies in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings, where her work focuses on India's foreign policy, particularly on its relations with the United States and China. So she's really an expert on this issue that we're talking about today. She's the author of Fateful Triangle: How China Shaped US-India Relations During the Cold War, and is currently researching the past, present, and future of the China-India-US triangle, including the development of interest-based coalitions like the Quad. She also hosts the Global India podcast. So we're very happy to welcome such an expert to this conversation.
Fantastic. Next, we have Evan Medeiros. Dr. Evan Medeiros is the Penner Family Chair in Asia Studies and the Kling Family Distinguished Fellow in U.S.-China Studies at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. His expertise spans East Asian international politics, U.S.-China relations, and China security policies. Professor Medeiros has a unique blend of research and practical experience. He served as President Obama's top advisor on the Asia Pacific, and he coordinated U.S. policy across a variety of realms. So we're really pleased to have you and your perspective on China here today, Evan.
Right. And of course, this conversation has to include Susan Shirk, my mentor and colleague, as well as the founding director of the 21st Century China Center. She's currently research professor at the UC San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategy. She's the author of award-winning books on China, including most recently Overreach, How China Derailed Its Peaceful Rise. From 1997 to 2000, Susan served in the Clinton administration as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of East Asia and Pacific Affairs. She continues to lead some of the center's policy program, including the UC San Diego China Forum and the Task Force on U.S.-China Policy. So we're very happy to be able to have Susan, who also just came back from China, to be part of the conversation. In any event, we look forward to a really stimulating discussion. We'll go for about 40 minutes now with some moderated questions. Then we'll turn to the audience questions via Zoom. When the time is right, please use the Q&A feature to submit your questions at any time. And with that, let's get started with Ach's first question.
Wonderful. Thank you. So this is a sort of a warm up now that we are done with the introductions. Before we bring in the U.S. into this sort of trilateral relationship conversation, let's just start with the relationship between India and China. So this relationship has clearly had its bright spots and its dark spots. At this moment, from where you stand, and I'm addressing this to all four of our panelists, what are the top two issues that really dominate this relationship, and what might prevent these two giants from sort of forging a friendly path in the future? So I would love just to kick things off, a quick 1 minute answer from each of you. Maybe we can start from the top with Dhruva.
Thank you, Aj, and thanks again for UC San Diego for hosting this. Um, I would say, look, I can actually say there's one thing, which is sort of to get the second part of your question, one thing holding back the relationship, and that's basically the nature and worldview of the Chinese Communist Party, which is for a variety of reasons, and others have written about this in much more detail than I have, be beyond my knowledge. But it is fundamentally a worldview that is incompatible with building an inclusive international order. And you see that play out with India, specifically in the bilateral relationship, but also play out with a lot of other countries in its periphery and beyond, with Japan, with South Korea, with the Philippines, farther afield with Europe, even with Russia, which is perhaps its closest partner, but it has a sort of very unequal relationship with partnership with China. So I think that's, if you say, like, that's the one thing that is holding back the relationship. If you were to characterize the bilateral relationship, I mean, overall, it's become more competitive, despite the recent thaw over the past decade or two. And there's sort of four dimensions to it. In all of these areas, it's become more competitive, which is bilateral security on the border, the disputed border, regional security in South Asia, in the Indian Ocean region, bilateral trade and economic relations, which have again become more competitive from being something that people thought would be more constructive in the past, and on the multilateral system, the global multilateral system. So I think every aspect of the relationship that you look at has become more structurally more competitive.
Fantastic. Thank you. So Chinese Communist Party is the biggest roadblock. Tanvi, agree, disagree, and what are your views?
Well, I'll kind of add to it. Maybe, I think fundamentally, in terms of the differences between China and India, you have to think about the border dispute that's not the only issue between the two countries, but I think is the fact that it has not been resolved is a manifestation of some of the other broader issues we'll talk about. But I think even more broadly, Ken Lieberthal had written about this on US-China relations, strategic mistrust. I would say there's perhaps strategic distrust between China and India. And I think in India, you see, and that's kind of the second thing, other than just the manifestation, which comes down to the border dispute, is in India a sense that, and this used to be a belief about the US in the 80s, now a fundamental belief that not only do India and China have different views of visions of the region, the Indian government will not use the word China, but they'll say we want not just a multipolar world, but a multipolar Asia, not a unipolar Asia, which they imply is what China wants. But that there's a belief in India that that China is actually out to stop India's rise and essentially contain and constrain India. And so not just affecting Indian security and prosperity, but its autonomy as well.
Very interesting. Evan, go ahead.
So, you asked for two issues. To be very, very practical, and I should say I very much agree with the prior interventions of both Dhruva and Tanvi. They very nicely captured the conceptual differences between the two. But in very practical terms, it's about the border and it's about Pakistan, right? In other words, you have two very practical issues where the security interests of India and China diverge far more than they converge. And of course, we know in recent years, there has actually been direct armed conflict between the two, um, on the border issue. So while I think that the security competition captures the broader differences in worldview, the broader differences in political systems and values in the history of international relations, even when you have converging values, similar political systems, differences in big differences in security issues sort of trump all of that. So I think that that's at the heart of it, Pakistan and border, but it's certainly not it doesn't exclude the other issues that my colleagues very articulately pointed out.
Thank you. Susan, you can round us out.
Well, I agree with pretty much everything that my predecessors here have said. But one thing I'll just note is there's also a lot of rhetorical and ideological similarity in the focus on what we now call the global South and multilateralism. And that's what's kind of interesting is you can imagine that if this mistrust and this rivalry didn't exist, and if the security problems like the border had been resolved by now, as China did with other bordering countries, that in fact, they might be much more aligned in countering the United States and other Western countries, and even colluding with one another or cooperating with one another on global issues, with the audience largely being other developing countries. In a way, it's kind of a throwback to the old days when this non-aligned movement first got started, that China and India, you can imagine, might be have an interest in working together to show that their version of global order, aim with the audience largely being the global South, of multilateralism, might really be superior to what the West has on offer.
Great. So the next question that we have is for the two India experts in the group here. My question is, so this, I think, I'll first track to Tanvi because she has the historical perspective. But as you know, the relationship between the U.S. and China went through these, different periods. First deep hostility in the 50s and 60s, and then rapprochement, and then starting 2014 or so, more competitive stance. In your analysis for Indian policymakers, how did they see in the rapprochement period? How did they see as India's best positioning for for the interests of India, of course. And then how has that changed in the more recent period of competition between the two countries? And then we'll go Dhruva.
So how do they see U.S.-China rapprochement?
No, how did Indian policymakers see the best positioning of India during the rapprochement period and then also in the current more competitive period?
I think, some of this goes back to what Susan was saying about think these commonalities or alignments that India and China as two then developing countries and emerging market economies eventually saw. I think you saw a period in the 2000s where India and China thought that one, they had done the border issue, they had reached a set of agreements that essentially allowed them to say, we will maintain what they call peace and tranquility at the border, but that would allow them then to engage economically, benefit, also not have to focus on border crises, but actually focus on economic growth and development. There was also the sense of, and again, a shared kind of concern about the West dominating international institutions. Any joint kind of almost sense of grievance, but also very practical that, they didn't have seats at the table. I mean, China obviously had at the UN Security Council, but things like global economic governance institutions, as these two economies were growing, that they didn't have that voice in the world, on the international order, that their kind of size, their heft, their civilizational, power, their historical sense as nations, that it wasn't reflective of these two countries. And so the sense, and then on, specific things like trade, like even, climate change, a sense of kind of convergence on some of these issues. And that reflected in not just the two sides sitting down and having kind of these summits, but also in regional institutions, and particularly in multilateral forum, actually sitting down together, whether there was this kind of, if might remember at I think it was the Copenhagen at one of the COPs, at the climate change talks, President Obama sitting on one side of the table and the Chinese and Indian leaders on the other side. And so you saw that it was the US that was actually non-aligned or unaligned with where China and India were. I think, though, and you also saw the Russia, India, China trilateral, the BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa grouping as a reflection of that. India saw them as kind of non-West groupings. And at that time, I think China was in that space as well. I think, though, what you saw, and this goes to Evan's point about the fundamental differences, India at least tracks kind of the change in what they saw as kind of more assertive Chinese behavior to somewhere between that 2006 to 2009 period, and start seeing a more assertive China in the region and vis-a-vis India. But it's only after Xi Jinping comes to office that the border, which had there been a lull there hadn't been major border crises, both sides had respected agreements. You started seeing in 2013, 2014, small one in 2015, 2017, and then kind of a fatal crash in 2020 over the border that then actually starts not just, it flares up the border, but in India, the sense that, we've sat down and we'd reached these agreements with China and wasn't sticking to its commitments. So how can we trust that, you're going to stick to these agreements, along with then everything else, whether it's China's support of Pakistan, whether it's China-India economic ties that were pretty asymmetric. All these issues then come to the fore, along with all the other issues that we talked about.
So would you say that it's purely behaviorally driven, how Indian policymakers see China, or is it both behavioral, but also, just the rise of economic and military strength within China?
I think that's an interesting question, right? Because, and Dhruva might have views on this as well. I think it's this question of you do have, is the behavior connected to that capability growth? Because, if you 35 years ago, India and China had economies the same size. So there wasn't, now China's economy is more than 5 times of India. Its defense budget is 3.5 times of India. So this question is that larger capability, irrespective of, where India is that shaping, and we have two China experts who can speak that, how much is that shaping China's sense of the region, what it can do? One question is, did Beijing, in the case of, these 3 or 4 crises I mentioned, was there a sense, at least in 2020, it's clear this is not something that a local commander could have done. This was from Beijing. And is there a sense that, you could salami slice a little bit at the border, India would just accept it because China is so much larger and everybody would move on, except for the fact that India, even if it's five, it's not as large as China, and the capabilities gap has grown. It is going to. There's a pretty standard way that India was going to then hold the line at the border and relations with China. So I think, to me, those two things are connected because you didn't see these many border crises when China didn't have the capability. The other thing, just on the capability thing that has changed at the border, is now you see an infrastructure buildup first on China's side, then on India's side. That's actually just making, when these two sides now, they have patrols, and this border is just much more accessible for both sides. But I think what that also does is it allows for, say, this movement at the border that China undertook and the PLA undertook in 2020 that would not have been possible. And for India then to respond, to kind of hold the line there, you wouldn't have necessarily been able to have that play out in the same way about 10 years, 15 years ago.
Great. We'll go to Dhruva quickly. So basically, what is Indian policymakers positioning in this triangular relationship, and is that driven by China's behavior or China's economic rise, or both?
I would put it this way, that I think there was a period when India contemplated or explored the possibility of an isosceles triangle. That is a sort of roughly equal distance between, or equal relationships, or similar relationships with the United States and with China. And that period was roughly from 2009 to 2014 or so. It was motivated in part by the global financial crisis and the immediate aftermath of that, and the feeling that India, along with China, sought to reform the international system and wanted greater representation for themselves and other developing countries in that. And Tanvi mentioned a number of areas where this came to the fore, whether it was on international financial institution reform, whether it was on climate change, or a number of other multilateral negotiations. It came to an end, I think, with a series of events that Tanvi laid out. 2014, I think, was a major one after a few months after Prime Minister Modi's came to power. 2017, and then 2020, of course, being the most dramatic. And so again, it went from, I think we're now at a stage where this is very much a scalene triangle. And so it was both in response, I think, to a few things. One was just the international circumstances, to China's own actions and behavior and assertiveness, which is again a combination of both the capabilities and intentions shown by the PRC. And then I think there was also a domestic debate in India about this. And a combination of those factors meant that you had roughly, it wasn't a clean break, but you did have these sort of two distinct phases where a sort of a China policy roughly in this period where India attempted to find areas of cooperation with New Delhi and Beijing, and then an area where, again, it became just structurally more competitive. And even the areas which we were talking about as being areas of potential collaboration on bilateral economic trade issues, suddenly there was a realization that this was actually undercutting Indian industrialization efforts, that the trade disparity, the trade deficit was really sort of unsustainable in the long run. So on multilateral issues, again, we saw China blocking India's entry into nuclear suppliers group, blocking India at the UN Security Council, stopping counterterrorism initiatives, again, directed at Pakistan, as Professor Medeiros mentioned. So I think, again, all of that came to an end. So again, we've gone from an isosceles triangle, or at least attempted trying to forge one, to a scalene triangle.
I love the references to math because as a math major, it's nice to project things into my language. So thank you. Similar question to the China experts. I mean, maybe we can start with Susan on this and move to Evan. But I think Tanvi put it well. There's a huge kind of capabilities gap between India and China, and sometimes I perceive sort of a non-symmetry, to follow the math analogies, um, between kind of how the Chinese perceive Indians and as a special or a relationship that is kind of taking a lot of brain space versus just another economic partner or just another border. Um, and how the Indians perceive China. So the Indians devote a lot of time thinking about China and its ascendancy and whether they're kind of counterweights, et cetera. So Susan, how much brain space is being devoted to India in China right now? And if it's, considered an important or special relationship, do they see India as a country that's fundamentally going to be increasingly aligned with the US, or is it more a power that can still be sort of won over by Beijing? And I guess maybe, well, let me stop there and get your thoughts, and I'll follow up.
Well, when I was in China for 6 weeks and just came back, and I would try to initiate conversations with international relations experts and retired officials, current officials, journalists, business people. And frankly speaking, there is not a lot of brain space being devoted to India. And this is, there's so much else that they're worried about, especially the erratic and unpredictable behavior of the United States. Of course, the rise of the Trump era in the United States has really changed the way people in China look at their own government. He really made Xi Jinping look a lot better, which, is depressing to see the growth of anti-Americanism too. So, that's really where the thoughts are and the eyes are. And so in a way, this is a lot of continuity, because when I was in government, I was Strobe Talbot, after the Indian nuclear test, sent me to India to talk about China. And that was totally fascinating. And then was part of another study project on China, India. And of course, after the Indian nuclear test, they wrote a letter to President Clinton saying they had to test nuclear weapons because of the China threat. So the focus was on China and the China threat. And, what I have learned over many years is that India pays a lot more attention and weights the China threat much more heavily than China does toward India. And of course, China's security interests have always been focused more toward the Pacific side as well. So I'd say that there's not that much brain space being taken up with relations with India. The Chinese policymakers recognize that the United States has tried to use India to balance against China. And of course, the article by Kurt Campbell and Rush Doshi about an alliance between the United States and India, I'm sure actually nobody brought it up. So, but in the past, they certainly brought up US nuclear deal with India, and things like that. So they see US strategy as very transparent, but they focus on it more as a US balancing strategy than on India per se.
Very interesting. So, Evan, same question. You'd love to get your thoughts, and kind of as a follow-on, how does this kind of brain space that's being taken up, so to speak, reflect in the current scuffle between the U.S. and India? How is it being viewed by the Chinese? Is this like a temporary blip in an otherwise strong partnership, or is this viewed as, hey, this is an opening to bring India more into the fold into China?
Great questions. Very much agree with Susan's insights. I would say that if structural competition between China and India is one big feature of the relationship, another major feature of the relationship is what I would call multiple asymmetries. Asymmetries in perceptions, asymmetries in capabilities, and asymmetries in policies. And so let's start with perceptions. And I think Susan's absolutely right. There are far more people in Delhi that think about China than in Beijing that think about India. But that is changing because if the Chinese are anything, they're inveterate strategic opportunists. They see an opportunity and they jump in and seize it. And there's nothing wrong with that. And so while there's historically and generally speaking, not a lot of brain space in Beijing devoted to thinking about India. I think there is quite a bit of discussion now to identify the opportunity and to exploit it. But exploiting it from Beijing's perspective is not some grandiose expectation of alignment with India. I think the Chinese have no illusions about the structural competition economically, technologically, and national security, but rather I think that they think that it's entirely possible that they can maybe lean into India's most NAM-like, global South-like, multilateralist instincts to make it truly neutral because Beijing was worried about the sort of leaning of India, especially the defense establishment in India toward the United States. The other asymmetries that are important in thinking about Chinese perceptions of India are capabilities, and the Chinese are acutely aware of the gap in capabilities that are very meaningful. The size of their economy, the fact that China's growth strategy going forward is going to accentuate the gaps with India, in particular, the very, very heavy investment by Xi Jinping in technological self-reliance. And fellow China specialists will know that the fourth plenum of the 20th Central Committee is going on today. They're going to release the outline of the 15th five-year plan, just to sort of confuse everybody with lots of numbers. And in the 15th five-year plan, they will talk a lot about technology self-reliance. And that is about building China into a global technology manufacturing superpower, focused on EVs, batteries, clean energy, et cetera, and certainly the information technology space, the computing space is a big, big part of that. So I think the capability symmetry is important. And the last symmetry that I'll mention is in military capabilities. And it's incumbent in this conversation to appreciate all the strides China has made in conventional military capabilities. And importantly for India, something that hasn't gotten as much discussion in these conversations is the substantial expansion of Chinese nuclear capabilities, which has huge implications for the United States and huge implications for India. And when I think about an asymmetry in capabilities, I think that's one that's going to be persistent and important, and one that Beijing clearly is thinking about when they size their nuclear force, and when they conceive of their overall posture. They have to take India into account. So I would say multiple asymmetries in the relationship. The Chinese are acutely aware of them, but I think that they believe that those asymmetries work to China's advantage now and over the long term.
Right. Thank you.
Great. I have a question for the India experts. So in the China field, there used to be this kind of debate about what is China's strategic objective? But in recent years, I think there has been this more emerging consensus, especially with publication of our good friend Rush Doshi's book on long-term competition between the US and China, which is that Chinese leaders, their strategic objective has been to build up capabilities, both economic and military, so that one day it can stand toe-to-toe with the United States. I mean, arguably, it has reached that point at this moment. But my question is whether the strategic objectives for India is consistent? Well, first of all, what is it today as it stands? And is it consistent over time, the way that we now believe Chinese strategic objectives has been very consistent over time? And if it hasn't been consistent, how did it change over time? We'll start with Dhruva this time.
Thank you. I mean, I tend to, and I mean, I structured my book this way. I think, India's objectives since independence in 1947 have really been determined by the larger international context. And you had sort of a different set of objectives in the early years of the Cold War, a sort of change over the course of the Cold War. It was not consistent throughout. Again, further changes after 1991, which coincided both with India's economic liberalization, but also the kind of, again, changing structural dynamics, the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union. And then I think a big change really after 2008 or so, which was, again, the global financial crisis. India had new capabilities. Now its economy was in a different place, and its ambitions are obviously different. To put it simply, I would say that, I mean, at least at this point of time, unless there's, again, a major change, India sees itself as soon to be the world's third largest economy. It's probably fourth at this point in time, but still well behind the United States and China for the foreseeable future. And that's I think just the reality that India is going to have to deal with, and how to navigate that world where it has in fact risen relative to almost every other power in the world, except for China. And where, as we've spoken about, the gap between India and China is actually has grown. And so I think that is really that's having a lot of implications, both, again, for India's own growth and capabilities and the opportunities and challenges presented by that, whether, again, it's global market access, whether it is sourcing key technologies, both military or key other critical technologies, what it means for India's neighborhood, both the immediate neighborhood and its extended neighborhood, the Indo-Pacific, and the balance of power there. And again, it's being altered by China's rise and defined in many ways by China's rise. What that means for the India-Pakistan dynamic and India's integration with its West, and what it means for India's multilateral ambitions as well on a global scale. So all of that is really being shaped by this emerging US-China competition that is playing out between these two very large powers, and India, as a distant third, is trying to see how to navigate that. Where I would end on this note, I mean, I'm sort of getting ahead a little bit of the conversation, but I would say I try and define India as a reformist power in this system, which is not a revisionist power that seeks to overturn many aspects of the international order, but one that seeks to reform it in order to advance its own interests.
Tanvi, do you take that realist perspective?
I have a slightly different way of thinking about it, which is I actually do think India's objectives have been fairly consistent since independence. They manifest, I think, according to India's capabilities, and the approach is different according to the international order. But I do think there are kind of four broad objectives that India has had: security, prosperity, which, you could say most countries have that. Two other things, though. One is autonomy. Its desire to be an independent actor, not join alliances, even though it might have very close partnerships. So being in that autonomy is important. And then finally, kind of seeking a rightful place on the world stage. And this is, yes, in part about status, but it's also about being able to shape the world around India, in which it grows, in which it kind of lives. I'll say one thing about kind of the autonomy aspect, and across these four objectives, one of the things, you asked about what had changed in China-India ties. I think India, for a brief period in kind of that 2000s period, used to see China as potentially, supportive, or at least, even if it didn't intend to be supportive, that China could be helpful to each of those objectives. If the border was stable, it helped India's security. It wanted to take advantage from the prosperity perspective of China's growing economy. It actually worked with China to try to reform the multilateral institutions to get more status. And it actually thought that a good relationship with China, which would help India strengthen itself, would expand India's options and autonomy. Now, I think on each one of those issues, it actually thinks China is the main problem, if not, the first, at least the second problem, that it thinks China is its biggest security challenge. it actually has gone from seeing economic ties with China as a opportunity to seeing them as a vulnerability because of some of the asymmetries. Same on status and on autonomy. It started thinking of China as the biggest constraint on these things. But I think because of, what Evan talked about, the multiple asymmetries across the board, that autonomy objective is now, so India's kind of desire for autonomy is still there. But one thing is very obvious to Indian policymakers, the need for alignment. So if you want to think about India as an approach, there's this constant tug of war, whether it's on its international economic policy, whether it's in terms of broader foreign policy, this tug between a desire for autonomy and a need for alignment. Because there is, yes, India wants to build its own autonomous capabilities, but it cannot grapple with China that is, that much larger than it without partners. And so you've seen India try to, the changing triangle, the shape of the triangle, as Dhruva said, is because there's this recognition that India cannot do this on its own. It can't achieve any of those objectives regardless of China, but it also cannot tackle its own China challenges without needing partnerships with countries that are like-minded. It cannot shape a favorable balance of power alone. It cannot ensure a multipolar Asia alone, and it cannot deal on the, they just like Dhruva said, there used to be this idea that India was going to walk this, find a third option in terms of technology choices. I think you're now seeing India make choices that are more aligned with kind of, the West writ large. And sometimes it's India's, digital payments and things like that, where India is the one who actually might have the competing choice and not necessary when it comes to China, and not necessarily the Western partners. But I think that's something that folks recognize. Hence, Kurt Campbell and Rush Doshi's piece about allied scale, even though India is not a formal ally, included India in that domain.
So I think although, okay, we were going to jump to an economic topic, but I mean, I think given what you two say about India's strategic interest, I want to go to Evan very, very quickly. And you said any tough question is fine, so I'm going to ask you a tough one, which will live on the internet, which is, given some of these interests of India, is what the current administration doing going to be compatible and be attractive to India, which of course would like to find some kind of balancing against the economic and military power of China? You're on mute right now, Evan.
Sorry about that. So the answer to your question is no. Alienating India, driving it away from the United States is not in our immediate or long-term strategic interests. Holding India to one standard, but letting China off the hook on the other standard makes no strategic sense to me. Why is India subject to 50% tariffs for buying Russian oil when the Chinese probably buy more oil and the Chinese are rebuilding the Russian defense industrial base? So no, that it doesn't make any sense to me. Another point that I want to make in this context, and one of the reasons I was so happy to get an invite to participate in this, in addition to, of course, the illustrious group, is the fact that there's a really interesting space between China's promotion of multipolarity and multilateralism and India's promotion of it. Because for China, when you look at China's actual behavior, its promotion of multilateralism and multipolarity, it has a decidedly anti-US and anti-Western quality to it, trying to diminish the role of the United States and dimensions of the rules-based order that constrain China. Whereas I would say India's promotion of multilateralism and multipolarity is a little bit more sort of ideological in nature. It's always been a key part of Indian foreign policy. Of course, I welcome my Indian expert colleagues to correct me there. But it doesn't always have the sort of hard edge of trying to, or being a proxy for trying to undermine the rules-based order and undermining American power. I sense a greater degree of ambivalence on the part of India about this. And so I think what the Chinese are trying to do now that India is frustrated and alienating with the United States is sort of Beijing wants to pull India into its orbit, into its narrative, which is very much an anti-American, anti-US narrative, one that finds a lot of resonance with countries like North Korea, Iran, etc. And so I think that, in understanding India's positioning vis-a-vis China helps us understand the degree to which international order is evolving into something that looks like global West, global East, global South in the famous article by Princeton political scientist John Eikenberry.
Anything to add to that among the panelists? Quickly. Oh, Susan, you're on mute.
Yeah, I just want illustrating Evan's excellent analysis here. It is interesting that Modi came and stood to Tianjin and joined Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un and Putin for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, which occurred right before this big military parade in Beijing, where the others stayed on, but Modi went home. So, I think that was a very clear expression on Modi's part that he would, he likes the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It's useful for India and it fits with India's approach to global order, but he's not about to stand there with the others in this new axis and harm India's reputation by doing that.
If I could just add a quick add-on to that. One more thing to note is Modi went to Japan before going to China, and one of the things about the Victory Day parade of September 3rd is that it very much is a sort of anti-Japanese message as well. So I think that was also a certain aspect. That was an added factor as well.
And do you see in India-Japan relations as making significant progress recently? Is that important thing that we should pay attention to?
Tanvi can add more to this. I would say there was a period, particularly under Shinzo Abe's prime ministership, where there was a lot of progress made, and again, a little bit before and after that as well. I think over the past few years, we've seen a little bit of a plateau in India-Japan relations, both on the economic side and the security relationship. There was some important developments on the security side that were made during Prime Minister Modi's recent visit to Tokyo. But I think there's some limitations also exposed by the relationship, whether it's on the defense industrial side. And some of it just has to do, again, with the structural limitations in Japan and India. But I think that the heyday of progress is sort of, we've seen significant progress over the past decade or two. I think a lot more work needs to go into developing that further if it needs to be. Just one more sort of a quick point I wanted to make, just to put it simply, and I would agree with what Professor Medeiros, Professor Shirk said. The distinction sometimes made is that what India strives for is more of a non-Western approach to these things rather than an explicitly anti-Western, and I think that's a sort of helpful way sometimes to phrase it.
Dhruva, that's very helpful. How should we think about India's positioning vis-a-vis the SCO versus its positioning in the BRICS? Is there a difference there, and what does that tell us about India's strategic intentions?
Again, Tanvi may have insights on this. I put it quite simply. Both were products of their times. India entered at a particular point of time. The BRICS had a narrower focus initially on reforming the international economic architecture. It led to the New Development Bank, which was created. But also we saw some of the limitations of that formulation. And as the BRICS have expanded, in fact, the common agenda has become a bit more diluted. The SCO had a different mandate at first, which was initially a counterterrorism mandate focused on Central Asia. And for India, it remains valuable primarily as a way to engage the 5 Central Asian republics. It again now has expanded. Pakistan is included as well, and that was one of the things China insisted on, was Pakistan's inclusion at the same time as India. But again, both have become kind of lowest common denominator talk shops. For India, I think there's still a remaining utility in both BRICS and SCO. They're somewhat different from each other, again, both because of their mandate and their constitution. But I think we take it for what it is.
Can I pull this thread one more time, just to sort of, I think the distinctions here are important given where we are in the evolution of global order today. You mentioned sort of India talks in terms of being non-Western as opposed to anti-Western. Is there also a distinction between India's view of the liberal dimensions of the liberal world order and the rules-based dimension of the order? And is that because when we talk about Chinese strategic intentions, China is both anti-liberal and pretty selective in its support of rules-based order. How does India line up there?
I would actually be eager to hear others' thoughts on this, including Tanvi's, but I would put simply, India, when you talk about the liberal international order, that I think again is a product of a particular transatlantic history, and the liberal is used in a very specific context there, in an international relations context. That is often conflated whether it's in domestic political or in other ways. The term liberal can be quite loaded. And I haven't, to my knowledge, can't think of an Indian leader who has positively cited the liberal international order in any way, even rhetorically. However, I do think there have been occasions, and again, some people might remember specifics, where Indian leaders have spoken approvingly about the need for a rules-based international order. That there needs to be more multilateral governance, not less. There needs to be rules of the road for certain things. And so I think, again, rhetorically, even if there's not a significant substantial difference, a lot of American and European talk about liberal international order is really harkening back to a sort of nostalgic Cold War antecedents, which, again, India does not necessarily have a similar positive nostalgic view about. And therein lies, I think, a key difference, even if it is more symbolic than substantive. But
just say that there's a couple of things here, right? I think on the one hand, it is true that there were certain things, and this is why BRICS in particular, to some extent SCO, but there was this also sense that these countries were all sovereignty hawks. And for India, that's because of its post-colonial, history, that the idea of other countries intervening in your domestic politics, etc. So a lot of it was about, that was where the difference was. Because at the end of the day, even though, yes, India didn't have a seat at the table, there were Indians involved in, talking about in almost everyone, whether it was on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, whether it was at the San Francisco Conference on the UN, whether it was with Bretton Woods, whether it was at UNCLOS, Indians were at the table. They just didn't have, the status in terms of formal designation. So when people say, well, we have, like you hear this sometimes from China, we weren't at the table. Indians were at the table. They did, they felt that they didn't get adequate representation eventually, but these were considered to be, especially for an India that from independence on has felt buffeted by all these, by continental crises, but sitting atop an international waterway that it wants to keep open, that it did have an interest in this rules-based order. And so you have, for instance, you had not just talking about rules-based order, you will have Indian officials citing that, for example, there was an international tribunal judgment in a maritime dispute between India and Bangladesh, and India lost territory, and it said we will accede to that because it is what the international tribunal has said. And they will often point to that, when they're talking about supporting the Philippines over the judgment. Even in terms of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, India will not come out and condemn Russia as many wanted to, but it's quite unhappy and it made it quite clear that it believes in the territorial sovereignty and the existence of Ukraine as an independent state. Modi has spent, and this is where you see a distinction between India and China on Ukraine. Modi has spent a lot of time with talking to Zelensky. He has engaged with him, met with him multiple times. he has made clear that India wants to see and sees Ukraine as an independent country and whose sovereignty should be protected. They just won't criticize the Russians because they fundamentally believe in that principle, because they have two neighbors that also claim territory. There is this aspect where you hear Indian policymakers say, all big powers end up being, the principles are for its power that really prevails, not principle or precedent. But at the end of the day, as long as I think India, especially with our capabilities gap with China, India is invested in a rules-based order because that is what will allow it. It's going to be capabilities too, obviously, but it does want those principles to hold.
Well,
All right.
wonderful. We
Yeah,
only
go
have a
ahead.
few minutes left, so I wanted to just quickly turn it over to some of the questions that the audience is posing. Um, uh, we have a shorter question. Let me take that one first on the lessons that Beijing has taken from the recent India-Pakistan conflict. Um, Maybe Susan or Evan, maybe from the China experts, but we can open it up to everybody.
Well, again, I had difficulty getting people to talk too much about it, but what was played up in the Chinese media and what Chinese people were very interested in is the way Chinese military equipment seems to was used by Pakistan, and that was kind of a point of pride that that China now is a serious exporter and sharer of its own advanced military equipment, and that this was a kind of useful way for China to test this equipment in combat, including missiles, as well as airplanes and other stuff too, I guess, and without itself going to war. So, I think that's an interesting dimension to it.
Fascinating.
I just say one thing that is I have a question about that I don't have the answer to, which is, a lot of discussion about the, PL-15 missiles or the aircraft. But one thing, Pakistan also has Chinese kind of air defense systems, and those didn't work very well. So is there learning about, what's the sense in Beijing, why they didn't work? Is it that they're going to point to Pakistani performance, or is there something inherently within, the systems themselves? And I suspect there'll be some learning about that too. Not just kind of that first day, but the subsequent days where you did see kind of Pakistani air defenses not be as effective. So I'm sure there will be some thinking about what went wrong there.
If I can jump in, it's been very interesting to see a few things. One is, three of India's neighbors are the three largest recipients of Chinese arms, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Myanmar. And again, I think it's sort of worth looking again at sometimes at the actions rather than the rhetoric coming out of Beijing about how much attention they pay to the broader region, particularly from a security standpoint. You saw two things definitely, which is in third countries, and I talked to people officials in Europe, in Latin America. You saw the Chinese go on a strong offensive as a propaganda offensive to say that the India-Pakistan conflagration was sort of proof of the superiority of Chinese weapon systems. So they've actually tried to use this, whatever the facts are, tried to use this to promote their own defense exports in third countries. The other thing that's been really interesting to observe is how much it's not just the equipment, but also the degree to which Pakistan has relied upon training and doctrine and tactics, which the PLA employs. And in some ways, again, this is a test bed. Pakistan is proving to become a test bed for PLA tactics and then doctrine as much as it is the hardware as well. So I think that those are, again, some things that I imagine people are looking at quite carefully. One thing to observe also is that there was, I think, at least one PL-15 that landed intact in India, which I also imagine is an intelligence gold mine as well. But we may find out more about that in the future.
Well, thank you so much. I know we have 0 minutes left, so I wanted to just uh, convey my gratitude to all the panelists, as well as the China Center for co-hosting this event. This was a wonderful discussion. It'll be made available online, for those of you who can't view today. So thank you once again, and I hope this is the start of a conversation across, the three contexts, U.S., India, and China, through the most important countries in the world order today. So thank you very much. I appreciate it, and have a great day.